Good morning. I'm Dana Goldman. I'm director of the Leonard D. Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics at the University of Southern California. And I'd like to welcome you to this meeting. We're co-hosting this meeting with the Engelberg Center for Healthcare Reform at Brookings, and we're very pleased that you could join us today to talk about two issues that I believe are right at the forefront of the health policy debate, that is biomedical innovation and economic value. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. You should have received a folder that contains the agenda, some speaker bios, a discussion guide, and materials from our keynote speakers. If you don't have a copy, there are copies at the registration table. There's also one agenda change, which is that former budget director Peter Orszag will be talking at 12:05. Throughout the program, we've built in opportunities for audience participation after each keynote, as well as during the panel discussions. So if you have a question or a comment, you can raise your hand. A staff member will come by with a microphone. And for the benefit of participants in the overflow room and those who are going to be viewing on either television or the webcast, please introduce yourself and please use the microphone. And as always, please try to avoid soliloquies. For those of you who are watching next door in the overflow room, you can step into the main auditorium in the back and raise your hand if you'd like to participate in the discussion. This event is being broadcast and as well as webcast, but unfortunately we can't take questions from the webcast audience. But everything's going to be archived on the Brookings Center website as well as our website. And if it isn't obvious, there are media here, so everything is going to be on the record. And finally, and most importantly, for all speakers, I want to draw your attention to Michelle. Michelle, raise your hand, please. She is going to be holding up time cards. It's important that we stay on track. So now, let me introduce Mark. Okay, actually, no, before I introduce Mark, I want to take this opportunity to make some comments. Sorry, Mark. So let me try to give you some background, and then I'll introduce it to Mark. And the background, I think, is that kind of the old model and where we're starting from. And the old model is that there's a lot of R&D that goes on in the healthcare sector, and this involves a trade-off. That is to say, in order to encourage innovation, we need to reward manufacturers with higher prices. But the high prices limit access to drugs. And so there's a tension. We'd like to lower prices today, and that would benefit current generations. On the other hand, if you think about future generations, they benefit from the high prices today in the form of new drugs and new treatments and greater innovation. And you can kind of see that in some work we've done at the Schaefer Center. What this chart shows is the longevity of a person who has reached age 55. And in 2010, a person who's 55 on average can expect to live 24.2 years. And life expectancy is slowly rising over time, so that in 2060, a 55-year-old can expect to live 25.4 years under the status quo. But suppose we came along and we said, well, one way to deal with this problem of access is to just lower prices across the board, not thinking about this innovation trade-off. Well, it turns out that what that would do if the U.S. imposed these price controls is it would limit, it would result in a decrement in life expectancy. That is to say, people won't live as longer. And the reason why is because we don't have new drugs. And in fact, even for the current generation of 55-year-olds, they'll be harmed in terms of health by about 0.2 years, whereas for future generations, the cost is about 0.7 years. So this is the kind of calculus that we're doing right now. Another way to see this is to think about a policy that's similar to Medicare Part D. That is to say, we subsidize the cost of drugs. That is, we lower copays. And in that case, you would actually increase life expectancy, and you actually benefit. And the reason why is there's more people buying drugs today. That spurs more innovation, and that leads to development of even more drugs going forward. So there are these dynamics that are very important to keep taken into account. But I think the goal of this discussion, and I think it'll come out as we go forward, is that this old model presents what we believe is a false dichotomy. That is, it's not a trade-off of revenue versus innovation necessarily. And the question is, how do we design new reimbursement models that both reward value and innovation? And with that, now, I'll let you come up, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks for kicking us off. And I'd like to add my good morning to all of you as well. On behalf of the Engelberg Center here at the Brookings Institution, welcome today for today's event. We are sponsoring this, as you know, with Dana Goldman and his colleagues at the Schaefer Center at USC. We're hoping this is the start of an ongoing collaboration that focuses on some practical implications of research and policy analysis that's going on to better understand this very crucial issue of how do we capitalize the most on the potential for 21st century innovation while keeping healthcare costs as affordable as possible. And to start that process, I'm very pleased to have such an outstanding group here with us today. Experts, people who have a lot of experience in the biomedical industry, researchers, all of you who are becoming part of this effort. It's a vitally important one. It's very timely. The goal of biomedical innovation with economic value is extremely important. I want to take just a few minutes to add to the framing that Dana began a minute ago as we launch today's meeting. As you all know, promoting biomedical innovation is crucial for many reasons, most importantly for the advances that it provides in our ability to diagnose and treat diseases, to improve quality of length of life, and most importantly and increasingly to prevent health problems from developing in the first place. The contributions that our science industry makes to our nation's economy, though, are also crucial for America in the 21st century. And this is a very exciting time for biomedical innovation. The emerging fields of genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, systems biology, understanding what works best in terms of combinations of treatments for individuals earlier and earlier in the disease process, as well as advances in diagnostics and device technology. All of this offers the promise, the potential of safer, more effective, and much more personalized care. But there are issues that suggest our biomedical enterprise is not running as smoothly and quickly and effectively as it could, and so is not fulfilling the potential benefits it could offer to us. Productivity in biomedical innovation, according to a range of standard measures, has been declining. The amount of what we're getting out for what we're spending. The impact of recent breakthroughs in areas like genomics and these other new sciences that I just described have been tremendous in the lab, but more limited in actual patient care. And part of today's discussion is going to focus on the underlying barriers to more effective and efficient innovation, the specific implications for regulation, reimbursement, and evidence development, developing better evidence on what works faster so it can have a more timely and effective impact on patient care is what's important. And that's what I mean by value. This is not an issue of rationing or something like that. It's an issue of how do we get the most as quickly as possible out of the dollars that we spend on research. How can we make research do the most, not only for improving our economy, but improving the health of Americans today and in future generations. Now, in doing this, we also need to do all we can to make sure that health care is affordable. This is a major challenge for many American families today. It's a major cause of concern with our nation's fiscal outlook and with the fiscal outlook of states around the country. As all of you know, the rate of growth in healthcare spending is a major contributor to these economic challenges that our nation is facing and to the challenges of Americans being able to take advantage of all that modern technology may have to offer. In fact, on our current trajectory, healthcare costs will consume more than a quarter of our GDP by 2035, and that will increasingly force difficult decisions about benefits, about access, and challenges like that. So in very real ways, rapidly rising costs threaten the potential for innovation. What we want to have is a virtuous cycle of more innovation leading to more growth and better health, not a vicious cycle of more innovation raising more challenges about affordability and then leading to challenges in achieving the potential improvements in health for our nations. So our goal today is to identify practical steps based on new ideas, new research, new thinking that's going on that can help us both promote biomedical innovation and avoid unnecessary costs through new models of reimbursement, new models of developing evidence on what works, new models of supporting effective, innovative, and personalized care. If we don't address these kinds of challenges, the consequences will be substantial. It could be tighter regulation of prices, could be outdated benefits and coverage policies that don't keep up with the potential for personalized medicine. It could be greater uncertainty for people who are investing and companies that are developing or contemplating developing new medical products, leading to a slowdown in the development process, all of which would contribute to a further slowing of productivity in biomedical innovation, and most importantly, to a slowdown in the potential improvements in health of the American public. The good news is that there are opportunities to promote innovation and to avoid unnecessary costs. We're going to discuss these in greater detail over the course of our event today. These include ideas like investments in infrastructure that enable the exchange and analysis of clinical data, that enable measurement of performance of all types of healthcare interventions, and enable us to learn much more from the routine delivery of care. For example, the Beacon Community Program is using health IT in 17 communities around the country to learn more about what technologies work best in actual practice for particular kinds of patients. Also, we want to focus on developing better evidence on what works. The Economic Recovery Act, other investments at the federal and state level and in the private sector are improving our capacity to learn more about the effectiveness of different treatments in individual patients. The Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute has the potential to fill in gaps in evidence to support better individualized decision-making and better use of the combinations of treatments that are increasingly part of personalized medicine. Similarly, agencies like the FDA are working with the private sector on initiatives to learn more about how treatments are actually being used in practice to build up evidence as well. It's critically important as we do these kinds of steps to focus more on paying for the kinds of development of evidence and the kinds of improvements in care that can make the biggest difference for patients, paying more for better care, not just more care. Reforms like accountable care organizations and reforms in which medical product developers are being paid more when they actually take steps to improve health and reduce healthcare costs elsewhere in the system can be an important part of this effort. And we're going to hear later today about the concept of performance-based payment, how it's being extended to reimbursement for drugs, diagnostics, and other medical technologies, and can help reinforce some of these trends towards more effective innovation and better support for innovation that makes a difference in patients' lives. And finally, consumers, patients, are an important part of this as well, through opportunities, through incentives, where when they make responsible decisions, effective decisions about their own health, through approaches like value-based insurance design, they too can support better innovation to get to better health as well. And during the course of the day, you're going to hear about other ideas that people have that are being developed to address these challenges too. And those ideas are going to start right now. The format for today's discussion includes keynote presentations by Speaker Newt Gingrich and by Peter Orszag, people who have given a great deal of thought to these issues about innovation and economic development and our nation's fiscal outlook. Between them, we're going to have 3 panel discussions involving a range of experts who also have some important perspectives on where our policies can go to support innovation and avoid unnecessary costs in our healthcare system. The first panel will address how current payment systems and benefit designs impact biomedical innovation, and what reforms could help promote innovation and greater economic value. Second panel will focus on whether linking medical product reimbursement to clinical outcomes, the kinds of results that we want, can effectively promote innovation and avoid unnecessary costs. And then our third panel is going to talk about how we can improve our capacity to measure innovation and value in the healthcare system, for individuals in the healthcare system, for individual medical products, again, supporting these kinds of reforms. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce our first speaker, Newt Gingrich. It's a true pleasure for me to have him with us today. Speaker Gingrich, as you all know, has a very distinguished career in Congress in which was marked by support for many efforts to improve the nation's healthcare system, and in particular to support innovation in healthcare, biomedical innovation, and greater knowledge to make our healthcare system work better. Some of his key contributions included co-chairing the Republican Task Force on Health, substantially increasing investment in biomedical research, including being part of the effort to double the budget of the NIH, enacting FDA reform to provide for new pathways for therapies for terminal and degenerative illnesses to move more quickly through the regulatory process, a whole range of initiatives related to biomedical innovation and innovative healthcare. Since retiring from Congress, Speaker Gingrich has continued to devote much of his attention towards improving health care. I've had the chance to work with him on a number of initiatives since 2003 when he founded the Center for Health Transformation, which brings together public and private sector leaders around the agenda of creating a 21st century intelligent health system with the dual goals of saving lives and saving money. So very consistent with our theme for biomedical innovation today. In addition to his work with the Center for Health Transformation, Speaker Gingrich has served on the advisory board for the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality and on the Board of Regents at the National Library of Medicine. He is a member of the National Commission for Quality Long-Term Care, and I had the pleasure of working with him as well on the Alzheimer's Study Group. Speaker Gingrich has published extensively on a range of healthcare topics and a range of other topics, and he's received numerous related awards and honors. So please join me in welcoming Speaker Newt Gingrich to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm delighted to be here at Brookings for this, I hope, a very useful conference in beginning to set up a new set of ideas and talk about the current state of the art of people who are working on this. I want to say at the Center for Health Transformation, we're always delighted to have a chance to work with Mark on because he's one of the most thoughtful innovators in the country. I also want to mention that David Merritt's here, who's our Vice President for Public Policy from the Center, and we're both delighted to be here. And I want to particularly, in terms of the talk I'm going to give today, commend Jim Pinkerton, who I think has done as much writing on the potential for fundamental breakthroughs in health as anybody I know, and it really helped me understand this. Let me put in context, because I'm going to offer you something very different than you're going to get the rest of the day. I really believe we want to fundamentally reset how we think about things as opposed to thinking better about how we currently think. And the analogy I want to draw is, imagine we had a 1904 conference on transportation opportunities, in which we had a significant amount of concern about improved wagon design, some concern about improved stagecoach management, and a fair amount of concern about the railroad as the centerpiece of long-distance travel. And imagine that I had come to that conference and I had said, this is all very useful and in the short run will be very important, but the two things I think you should look at are two bicycle mechanics who in December of last year flew at Kitty Hawk, and a Edison Electric supervisor who is in the process of designing mass-produced cars. Now, I guarantee you in 1904, the Wright brothers and Henry Ford would have been laughed out of any Washington gathering of experts, because it was clearly pie-in-the-sky irrelevancy. By 1918, in planning the campaign for 1919, virtually every aspect of modern air warfare is in the campaign plan. By 1908, the Army has signed its first contract with the Wright brothers, which was for one airplane for $25,000. By 1909, the first large group of people see the Wright brothers fly when they fly around the island of Manhattan, and about 1 million people see them. In 1916, when Pancho Villa crosses the border and attacks the town of Columbus, New Mexico, John J. Pershing rents 2 cars to drive from the American military post to Columbus because he has no vehicles. And when he leads the expedition into Mexico, the aircraft he takes with him are underpowered and can't get through the passes because of wind. Now, all that changes literally almost overnight in World War I. And the great innovations, trucks, tanks, airplanes, by 1919 are the beginning of what became 20th century warfare. So I want to share with you a similar model, which is if you think about post-Obamacare solutions, what's clear from the Ryan budget, which I think is a historic and courageous effort to at least get to the right scale of thinking, is you cannot solve the cost of health care for an aging population within the current paradigm. It is literally impossible. What you can do, of course, is you can cut costs. You can ration. You can allow people to die earlier. You can minimize treatments. But let me just take the one example that Mark referred to. When we launched the Alzheimer's Study Group, we did so because it's probably the largest single pain and cost center of the next 30 years. The current estimates are that the federal cost alone, not state, not personal, the federal cost alone between now and 2050 of Alzheimer's is 1.5 federal deficits, federal debts. That is, everybody who tells you how big the federal debt is, about $14 trillion. Alzheimer's between now and 2050 is projected to cost the federal government $20 trillion. Now, you would think a serious country with serious leaders would look at a $20 trillion cost center, which, by the way, implies an enormous amount of human pain. Families are fundamentally dislocated. We were talking about it earlier today. The incidence of depression among caregivers associated with Alzheimer's is staggering. And yet there's no serious conversation. The New Yorker once did a cartoon that had a desk that had an in drawer, an out drawer, and a too hard. This is a city whose too hard box is enormous. And it's a huge challenge. So I want to suggest to you that bureaucratic cost controls will fail. They will lead to rationing. And this is a 50-year cycle. We really got into this in the 60s. And it hasn't worked at all, and so we keep doing things we know don't work. And what happens is we grind down the system. More and more people refuse to go into medicine. It's less and less fun. We're now about to see hospitals decide to go through very ruthless cost approaches. I know of at least 2 major systems that are going to analyze Medicare and drop every procedure that doesn't pay for itself. People just haven't understood humans react rationally to the signals that are sent. And so the question is, can we invent an alternative? What I want to suggest to you in a paper that will both be placed here, I think we actually have copies for all of you, but it's going to be electronically available both at healthtransformation.net, which is our Center for Health Solutions, and it's going to be available at Brookings. There's a paper arguing health solutions for longer lives, lower cost, and more American jobs. And I want to be quite clear. This is a deliberate, fundamental argument against the entire current delivery system, whether it's the right-wing version of the current delivery system or the left-wing version. It is an argument for a fundamental recentering of how we approach thinking about health and health care. The model, I'm actually trying to, some of you may be able to help me. I actually want to find an iron lung. We're thinking about going on eBay and offering to buy one. Because I want to use the iron lung as the centerpiece of this whole new approach. In 1952, there were 60,000 polio cases in the United States. The projected estimate was that polio patients would cost $100 billion a year. Salk and Sabin developed vaccines. Salk had the courage to give it to his own family in 1953. And in 1954, 1.2 million people were vaccinated. Now, I want you to take, I'm trying to get some of this to be a great Brookings project, because I don't have the staff. At the center, we don't have the staff for this. But it would be great to find an intern and say, lay over the development and implementation of polio vaccine, the current FDA model, and figure out how many additional people would have gotten polio during the 15 years that we went through the process of checking it out. Let's go back and look at it. Once upon a time, we were a country that had common sense. We won the entire Second World War in 3 years and 8 months, 44 months from Pearl Harbor to the surrender of Japan. It recently took 23 years to add a 5th runway to the Atlanta airport. I mean, if we're determined to be willfully stupid, we can be. But it's very expensive. So, take that model, and I want to now outline for you 7 major steps to recentering and rethinking the entire health system, starting with a comment by Elias Zerhouni when he was the head of NIH in an interview. And he said, and I think this is worth debating, and this is the kind of debate we need in the U.S. Congress, and it's the kind of debate we need, frankly, in the presidential campaign. It's the kind of debate we ought to have in academic centers. He said, for $10 billion in research in AIDS and HIV, we saved approximately $1.4 trillion in health costs, plus enormous amount of pain, lost lives, etc. He estimated it was 140 to 1 return on the investment. Now, I don't know if that's accurate or not accurate. It may have only been 70 to 1. It is vastly more than we got out of the stimulus. It is vastly more than we got out of the cost cutting we're about to go through. We're in a position of people who've decided, and in the congressional budget, I strongly applaud Paul Ryan, and I strongly applaud the courage to offer the right size argument. And I felt very sad that the president failed so totally to respond with the same level of seriousness. There are details I disagree with. One of them is cutting the investment in science and research. Because it's essentially like saying, I want to save money in your car, we're not going to change the oil. And for about a year, I can get away with that. And then the engine will freeze up and we have to replace the engine. But if I have a CBO that scores oil but doesn't score engines, I can annually replace the engine for free because it won't count as a budget cost. So here are my 7 proposals as a major step towards a health solution-based, and remember, health solution-based model for lower cost, longer lives, and more American jobs. First, fundamentally rethink the Food and Drug Administration. Don't marginally, we're going to hear a lot today about marginal fixes in a broken system. Drucker had a good rule. He said, if you weren't already doing it, would you start? And if the answer is no, why are you still doing it? And so if you ask yourself, what you want is a very scientifically oriented, very collaborative system that starts in the laboratory, is non-adversarial, has a free flow of information, and is continuously modifying and improving itself. I mean, when I go, for example, to the University of Pennsylvania and have somebody get up in the audience and say, they have a bioengineering device, which is the term that Pennsylvania apparently as opposed to regenerative medicine, they have a bioengineering device, which is both a biological breakthrough and a device. Currently under FDA organization, that means it goes to 2 different departments who don't talk to each other. When I go to Georgia Tech and have a computer specialist who is working on brainwave patterns in order to have people who are quadriplegic or are stroke victims think and therefore move a robot to do certain behaviors, and they tell me that 3 years ago they asked the FDA for permission to give away their initial non-invasive breakthrough device. And they can't find any place at FDA that can say, yes, it's okay. 3 years. This is just crazy. So fundamentally rethink Food and Drug Administration from the beginning. And here's the central point that I think I want to debate anybody in this country on. We're going to have in the next 25 years 4 to 7 times as much new science. There are more scientists alive today than all previous human history. They are connected by cell phone and internet. They have better computers and better instrumentation every year. They're then connected by venture capital, licensing, and royalty. You're going to have literally 4 times as much new science in the next 25 years. That's probably a conservative estimate. 65% of it's going to be outside the United States. Now, that implies the rate that if you were to try to take a historical analog, we are currently in 1880 trying to understand 2011 is comparable to being in 2011 trying to understand 2036. We have no institutions, not medical schools, not continuing medical education, not the bureaucracies like FDA. We have no institutions that are designed for continuous daily adaptation to innovation on that scale. That's how big the breakthrough has to be. And we have no payment models that are innovation-encouraging models. And so what we do is we become more and more out of touch with reality, more and more wedded to obsolete doctrines, and more insisting on paying for things that don't work because we can't figure out how to pay for things that might work because we can't bridge the gap. Now, that's how fundamental this is. So the first place to start is fundamentally rethinking the Food and Drug Administration and insisting that it both have a cost-benefit analysis of saying no. Saying no has to have a cost attached to it. Because today you have, it's free to say no and it's expensive to say yes, because if you make a mistake, you're going to have trial lawyers, you're going to have the Congress, you'll have the news media. But if you say no, you just kill people. And since they die quietly, it's not particularly embarrassing to the bureaucracy. And so, second, you have to have a jobs cost benefit analysis. We should measure annually how many new products were introduced outside the United States. I did 2 conference calls with regenerative medicine specialists, all of whom believe all major breakthroughs in regenerative medicine will be implemented outside the U.S. Now, that should really bother. That means every new job, every new patent, every new royalty will be non-American. Science will be American. Utterly irrational. Second, we should dramatically increase the National Science Foundation. The biggest mistake I made as Speaker in budgeting, we doubled the size of the NIH. We should have tripled the size of NSF at the same time. NSF's much smaller. The fact is, mathematics, physics, chemistry, developments in computational power are all central to what NIH does. NIH is driven by the knowledge generated by NSF, and we should see them in a combined state. As we've been continuing the work on the Alzheimer's study group that Mark referred to, it's very clear that the volume of knowledge that's going to come out in brain science probably requires 2 cycles of development and computation power to be able to cope with the data flow. The brain science will lead to the same volume of information as astrophysics. About the same number of synapses in your brain as there are stars in the known universe. So the scale of mathematical capability, the scale of storage capacity that's going to be generated by our ability to track brains is literally beyond our current capacity. We probably have to have 2 cycles of evolution in computational power in order to do brain science correctly. NIH needs to both be funded better and rethought. In 1981, I helped found the Military Reform Caucus. I was for a much bigger budget under Reagan. I wanted to see the Pentagon get bigger, and I would tell people I'm a hawk, but I'm a cheap hawk. Well, I think we should fundamentally challenge 2 aspects of NIH. The first is that small grant, peer-reviewed models are inherently conservative and inherently are much more inclined to be very limited in their breakthrough capabilities. The second is that the entire model of using the taxpayers' research money to subsidize academic bureaucracy should be fundamentally challenged. There is 0 reason to pay the overhead we pay at NIH in these grants. I mean, it's terrific for the universities. They will all scream like crazy. But I don't think the taxpayers should be told they are funding research when they're actually funding deans. Now, I may have a bias because I left academics as an assistant professor, so I'm... But I would suggest to you one of the major problems of higher education today is the degree to which the self-serving bureaucracies have gotten bigger, richer, more cumbersome, deeper, and pretend that they're in fact providing value. Just look at the overhead you'd pay for in the private sector, then go look at the overhead you pay for in the academic world and explain to me why we should tell the taxpayers that's their job. You could substantially increase the number of researchers if you paid fewer bureaucrats. And I think that's worth hearings. I think it's a legitimate question, and I think there are no sacred cows in a time of dramatic change. You have to be prepared to look at everything simultaneously. I also think you've got to look at things like the Apollo project, the Manhattan Project, the radiation lab at MIT in World War II, the way in which the evolution of the Human Genome Project, which began at the Department of Energy because NIH wouldn't do it, ended up being accelerated dramatically by having a private competitor. And you have to say to yourself, what do we learn from those? What do we learn from the National Cancer Institute and the way it's organized and its centers of excellence and the information flow? What does that tell us about how we should rethink and restructure NIH? Fourth, I believe we should take brain science and deal with it totally separately. The fact is that brain science is the area that will have the greatest breakthroughs. If we're going to get 4 to 7 times as much new science in general, we'll probably get 50 to 100 times as much new science in the area of brain science. The reason's simple. It's the most complex thing we study. We didn't have very good instrumentation until 15 or 20 years ago. We still don't have the kind of data we'll have in 10 or 15 years. It also has a potential to have the largest return on investment of anything in health. If you simply postpone the onset of Alzheimer's by 5 years, you cut the cost in half. Because Alzheimer's is a disease of older people. And if they get much older before they get it, they don't have it very long. Or they never get it. Now, every time I talk to brain scientists, they tell me they think the odds of our being able to postpone it by 5 years by 2020 or 2025 is very high if we have the right research strategies and the right investments. Well, that's about a $10 trillion savings. So you'd have to go to the Congress and say, all right, go to any private sector group and say, what would $10 trillion be worth in current investment? You know, there's a way to monetize this. What's a rational investment strategy if you can save $10 trillion? Well, it is radically more than we're currently spending. But we have tight budgets. So I have a very, very bold proposal. Take all of brain science off budget, move it out of NIH, create a brand new authority, go to the brain science community and say, what's the maximum you can spend rationally over the next 10 years? Fund it, issue Alzheimer bonds, and have a commitment that once you get the breakthrough, if you're going to save $10 trillion, the first tranche of savings to the government pays off the bonds. It's something which would make perfect sense in the 19th century for the British, who had sinking funds all the time. Something that would make perfect sense in a world where capital was invested over time. It makes no sense at CBO and OMB, and no sense in the congressional appropriation system, which is more of a comment on them than it is on the idea. But I think this is a very important idea. If we could eliminate Alzheimer's. I mean, by the way, I say all of brain science because in order to get breakthroughs with Alzheimer's, you have to study the whole brain. When you study the whole brain, you also get schizophrenia, Parkinson's, autism, bipolar, you name it. So what would the return be on that scale of breakthrough? It would be vastly more than the investment. And the return in human happiness, the return in people living full lives, the return in people being productive, it's just irrational that we don't do it. Fifth, we need to create an environment for dramatically more entrepreneurial startups. We've had a substantial decline in the number of small biological companies, for example. They've dropped by 25% in 4 years. I am for zero capital gains as a tax rate. I'm for 100% expensing of new equipment. I think if you have a better FDA model, you're going to get a lot more small startups. And I'm for the repeal of Sarbanes-Oxley, which produced no useful information in 2008 and is a fundamental inhibitor of small business and small companies. But we need to think about the context in which, if you really want lots of entrepreneurial startups, you have to have a larger context that generates the resources and makes it profitable and desired. Sixth, the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management and Budget should be challenged to have an intellectual reform comparable to the scale of what I'm describing. It would be impossible today to score the airplane. I mean, you can ride on it with somebody from CBO or OMB from New York to Los Angeles, and they basically still score going by stagecoach. And so while they're on the 747, they're explaining to you, you realize for the government, this trip requires 14 days in various stages. And you say, well, we're flying. They said, yes, but it's a theoretical approach. We're not sure flying will be around very long. We really don't want to score it that way. So seriously, go ask CBO and OMB to score postponing Alzheimer's by 5 years. They can't do it. I got a note from David Camp the other day. Last year, Senator Lemieux introduced the concept of going after fraud. Now, we have evidence from IBM, we have evidence from American Express, we have evidence from Visa. American Express has a 0.03 of 1% fraud rate. Medicaid in New York has above 10%. As a taxpayer, you are 330 times, 33,000% more likely to pay a crook through CMS than you are as a cardholder of American Express. The proposal was scored by CBO as costing money. Now, this is maniacally stupid. But CBO and OMB define the debates in this city and are major reactionary impediments maintaining the stupidity of current policy. And they should be challenged head on. They should be forced to score breakthroughs and say, okay, this particular project, if it works, would lead to this. And they can't today. They have no model of dynamic scoring. Finally, both CMS and private insurance companies should develop new models of experimental and pilot project funding to be able to go out and say, and the specific example I'll give you from a scientist who's working on it, if 10% of your kidney cells work, you do not need kidney dialysis. Through regenerative medicine, which is growing your cells and putting them back in so you have no problem of transplantation, you have no problem of rejection. In that model, you could take dialysis head on. Kidney dialysis is $27 billion a year, growing pretty rapidly. It'll pass the NIH budget. You can't today get any commitment from anybody that if you had a regenerative model that they would pay for the experiment to actually use it with people. So you can't go out to raise the capital because nobody who has capital wants to risk it to get through FDA to get into a payment system that probably won't pay for it. Now, that's just foolish. And two levels. One, money, and two, the quality of life. I had an uncle who spent 7 years on dialysis 3 times a week. People on dialysis have a 20% fatality rate annually. We'd like him to be living full lives, fully productive, fully engaged in life, fully earning a living, not having to spend all of their time as patients. That's the kind of payment reform we need, to have lots of small projects underway, which probably requires litigation reform, because after all, if you got involved in a small pilot project and anything went wrong, you'd promptly be bankrupted by trial lawyers and who are major inhibitors to scientific development. So I'm delighted to have a chance to chat with Mark, and I appreciate the chance to lay out these ideas.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. It's always interesting to hear your ideas, and I'll see if in these next few minutes we can draw you out from your very modest and incremental proposals there. I wanted to come back to this discussion around the health solution-based model, this vision for brain science that, in your view, sounds very transformative, and come back to a couple of the obstacles that may present challenges to getting there. You highlighted the importance of some substantial increases in funding, as well as a redirection of how we're funding the research, and that's not really what's on the agenda in Washington right now. We've got real concerns about deficits and concerns about whether even the current level of research funding can continue. Maybe talk a little bit more about how we get from that view to where you think we need to be.
Well, I think this is part of why you have to really challenge the whole Congressional Budget Office of Management Budget model. In the private sector, if you were in a recession, a company that was in a high-tech area would always distinguish between research and investment, which is essential to its survival, and expenses. And yet there's no model in Congress, no model in the executive branch for saying this is an investment, this is a cost. And so it starts there. I mean, I realize, having served for 20 years in Congress and led a fairly significant amount of change as Speaker, this is going to be a real fight. First of all, people will be puzzled by the ideas, and their first reaction will be to say no. Go back and look at the rise of the Wright brothers, and who got in such a big fight with the Smithsonian, they wouldn't give them their airplane for 37 years because the Smithsonian had failed to invent the airplane and was really irritated that these two mechanics from Dayton had done it. What I'm proposing is a fundamental rethinking at the level of the Budget Committee, the Appropriations Committee, the Authorizing Committee, at the level of the Office of Management Budget, at the level of the White House, that says we're now going to distinguish between investments and expenses, which is what we did. When I was Speaker and we decided to balance the federal budget, we consciously said, thanks in part to John Porter and Connie Mack, that we're going to double the size of NIH because we're actually going to set priorities. And I think the country will support a smart effort to get to a balanced budget. The country will not support a cheap effort to get to the balanced budget, because a cheap effort will sell out the future on behalf of current interest groups.
And then to follow up on that, with more support for the basic research, there still are, as you've noted, a number of steps to get from that to insights to products that patients can actually use to improve their care, to head off the brain diseases. You talked about some of the challenges with the development process, and it seems to me that there's just as much of a need for improvements in the development science, the kind of collaborations that you talked about, kinds of ways to shorten that multi-year process of getting from good ideas in the lab to treatments that can be reliably used in patients. And that seems to me as well to be an area that following your model would need some more investment, and that's investment that involves the FDA, the private sector that's also participating in that development process.
There are two parts to this. You'll notice, by the way, that I suggested that you should not only fund NIH, you should also rethink it. Okay, I'd say the same thing here. I don't know that a 21st century effective FDA would be more expensive or less expensive. But I want to back all the way out for a second to make this point. Two of the most effective systems approaches in human history were World War II and the Cold War. Both were characterized by very large-scale planning. and an ability to lay out a PERT system, or what might be called a Gantt system, but looking at all the linkage points and understanding how they fit together. The reason I gave you 7 steps is there is no single step that leads to the breakthrough. And I would argue that designing a large-scale model of the health solutions-based health system of the future would be an enormous asset to then show you what you're missing. Let me give you a couple quick examples. Kaiser Permanente and the VA have huge volumes of electronic data, which are not particularly used by NIH, which has no center of electronic epidemiology, which are not particularly used by the FDA. I mean, the fact is, when you have electronic data, you can take much higher risks with approving things because you can have real-time monitoring of huge classes of people. You could say, this is now approved for everybody who's on an electronic health record, which, by the way, would accelerate everybody using electronic health records overnight. And you could say to every drug company, you never again have to do a special class follow-up study because we're just going to track all the epidemiology of everybody in the country who's on that particular drug. And you could have real-time data every night. I mean, McDonald's gets 37,000 stores worldwide every night. So I'm not describing a distant future. I'm describing government systems that are 25 years behind reality. Now, I don't know if that FDA would be cheaper or more expensive. What I know is what we currently say is, in order to pay for the current bureaucracy and add 10%, we need a lot more money because we refuse to become more efficient or to use IT. IBM and Dell and others at the Tech Council produced a report last year that said, if you ran the federal government as though it was a multinational high-tech company, you would save $125 billion a year just by the flow of information in an intelligent way. So I can't tell you whether it's more expensive or less expensive because it is so different. I mean, is flying to California more expensive or less expensive than a stagecoach? Well, in constant dollars, it may or may not be more expensive. I think it's less expensive, but it may or may not be. But it certainly, in human cost, is radically less expensive.
I think we have time for one question from here. You want to go ahead? Wait for the microphone, please, Joel.
I run the VA Medical Research Program, and I want to make 3 quick comments. One is you should mention that sometimes. Secondly, you know, as somebody who runs from the point of view of researchers, we think a lot about top-down versus bottom-up programs. And while you're suggesting top-down programs, I think it's important to remember that the Manhattan Project started after the atom was split. The space program was an engineering development program. The basic research was really investigator-initiated type research that started that. So when you design a large program and give a lot of money to an area, you have to consider how you're going to do it and how the guidance is going to be. The third thing I want to say is that while we talk a lot about the problems with FDA and approving drugs and all that and the bureaucracy related to that, researchers talk a lot about research bureaucracy and what they have to go through. I don't think it enters into the public conversation enough. I think people are afraid to talk about it. And I think that's going to be very important in the future. I mean, you look at the bizarre consent forms that people have to, I hate to say that, somebody's going to probably fire me for that, but you look at the consent forms that I don't understand even sometimes, and just take it from there. Something has to be done in that area.
Yeah, look, that's a terrific thing, frankly, to end on, because it actually helps us open up intellectually the world I'm describing. And let me do it at 2 levels. I agree entirely that unless you've had the Hans Stresemann effect, you can't get to a nuclear program, and that the Manhattan Project is, in fact, engineering. The Apollo Project, essentially, is engineering. And I distinguish between the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Sciences. So I agree with that. And I think you'd have to think about, my point is, I believe we've crossed the proof of concept in brain science, and it's clear that if you dramatically accelerated the rate of discovery and the rate of integrating knowledge, that you would have enormous payoffs in brain science. I think I would not have said this but I was active in 1980. I wouldn't have said in 1980, let's focus on brain science. We didn't have the technology, we didn't have the instrumentation. It would not have been a rational investment, okay? Second, and you raised a different point, which I just want to suggest as a student of science history, is actually much more fundamental. And that is, when we figure out these big projects, which are, I think, necessary and good, and when we redo, and I think you raised a good point, congressional hearings on laying out the current foolishness of all of the layers of research application, all the layers of filling out forms. A very senior person at NIH said to me the other day, The number of documents we get that are never read is amazing. And so we really ought to have the courage to look at all this stuff in the eye. And the truth is, if you don't need it, don't do it. And to go back to apply lean manufacturing, in a sense, to the research application process would be a very useful model and a great series of hearings. But there's one other piece you raised I just have to say, again, I'm not a scientist, but I'm a student of history. Arthur C. Clarke had a great rule. He said, if a senior scientist tells you something can be done, it almost certainly is true. If a senior scientist tells you something can't be done, you have no idea. And the example is Einstein and Planck. No senior physicist thought Planck with quantum mechanics and Einstein with relativity were right. And so part of what you have to figure out is, because the politics and culture of science are very parallel to every other human institution. They become very conservatizing, they become very groupthink, they become very risk avoiding. Again, go back and look at plate tectonics, which was first developed in 1915, totally ridiculed, absolutely accepted by every paleontologist in the world as obvious, and doesn't actually become common sense in geology until after the International Geophysical Year of 1958-59, when it becomes impossible to reject. So you have to say to yourself, what are the areas, and you see some of this with Alzheimer's, where there are certain patterns that believe this is the right solution, why are you wasting your money over here? You have to figure out both how would you run big projects, how would you continue incremental progress in areas that were not ready for big projects, and how would you, and we do it in part by private foundations, but how would you ensure that the outlier is allowed to keep playing until the two bicycle mechanics invent flight, even while the congressionally appropriated $50,000 Smithsonian project is sinking in the Potomac? So I think that pattern, you're exactly right.
If I may say one more word, I absolutely agree, and something we worry a lot about is we're going to miss one of these things through our peer review system. And I think that's something, if you're a millimeter ahead of everybody, you're a genius. If you're 5 miles ahead of everybody, you're crazy. So,
Well, as somebody who has all too often been 5 miles ahead, I sympathize with that particular thing.
Well, I think that's a great point to end on. Thanks for getting this discussion going
Thank
forward.
you.
Thank you.